All right, hello and welcome everyone to this week's Coffee Kegs and Kriegsspiel podcast. Today's host is Umpire James, and we are fortunate to have Marcos Glez with us here. Thank you, Marcos, for joining us today.
Thank you, James, for having me.
Yep. So
Hi to all.
yeah. So today's podcast episode is going to be about Marcos's recently completed game, The Choice of the Nation, which features set in the Peninsula War for in the Napoleonic Wars. So, very fun game. I was able to play in it. It went quite long. It was a long game, played by post. So we're going to get into all that. Um, so first, Marcos, why don't you just introduce yourself? A little bit of background about who you are that people might not know, and how you got into Kriegsspiel.
Well, I have always loved history, and military history has always been one of my main interests in history. The first time I heard of Kriegsspiel was many years ago now in a book that talked about how could the Battle of Austerlitz be represented, and they talk a bit about Kriegsspiel. But I forgot about it for many years, and I rediscovered it 2 years ago when I was searching for a good tactical board game. So I found the International Kriegsspiel Society, and I joined it. And since I have been here, I have run 5 games. This was the latest. I am now running another one, and that's a bit it.
All right, good. And you are a master umpire within the IKS, correct?
Yes, with my second game, the Battle of Cerro Gordo, I became a master umpire, and I'm very proud of it.
Good. All right. Well, why don't you tell us about the game? So maybe some background on the history of it, why you wanted to do it, and then um, any particulars about your setup that were ahistorical, or what did you do, or what did you think about as you set up this game?
Okay. Being Spanish, I have always wanted to run since I joined the International Crispy Society. I always wanted to run a game set in Spain, and the Peninsular War is a setting that hasn't been represented in many games, and the campaign of Napoleon in Spain hasn't been represented in any that I am aware. So the idea came, and I developed it. Originally, the game was only going to represent the initial part of the campaign. The final part of the campaign, the retreat of the British troops from the area of southern Castile to Coruña. But then I first thought that maybe that game wouldn't be as interesting because it would be one side retreating all the time and another pushing, and I thought it could be maybe not very fun. So I decided to do the whole campaign of Napoleon. The planning fair. I postponed the game for a long time because it's a big game. It was an ambitious project, and I wanted to take more experience before running it. When I finally thought I had the necessary ability and experience to run it, I finally decided to run the game. So the setting was mostly historically, although I introduced it a bit, some modifications to make it more interesting. The main modification was that the British troops where instead of in Lisbon, I allowed them to deploy in a way bigger area just so that they were nearer to action, because if not, they would have to march all Portugal to the area of the north of Spain, and I thought that it would be a boring game for the British otherwise. It also gave the Spanish some numerical advantage because otherwise they would be tied, and the Spanish the troop quality of the Spanish army was inferior to that of the French. That's the main change. The rest is mostly historical. Where the depots were placed was not historical, but I just placed them in the main cities. But other than that, it was mostly historical.
Okay. How many players did you have total?
Well, we had 22 players, but second in command had an important role in which they would be given a role in their own corps. So, for example, we could have a second in command in charge of intelligence, in charge of dispatches, or in charge of the status of the troops with the struggling, the supplies that were available, etc. And we second in commands were also allowed to move independently from their commander, which made sometimes having some more players and sometimes having some more less. In general, I think we had always around 20-25 people moving independently.
That's quite a large game. Now, yeah, your 2IC system was pretty different from what's normally done because normally the 2IC sees the exact same, receives the exact same information as the primary player, and but in your game, at least for a while, the 2ICs would receive separate information, and so they had to, if they didn't communicate with the primary player wouldn't have all the information that they could. So it required coordination and helped involve the 2ICs more. How was, as an umpire, how was that experience? Would you do that again? Did it work? What was your view on that?
Well, that system, I introduced that system because one thing that I have noticed since the beginning of being in the IKS is that second in command many times don't have anything to do, and they just go AFK, and they disappear from the game. They are there, and maybe they are. So I have always wanted to give them a bigger role, a bigger impact in the game. I tried it in the previous game I ran, in which I introduced the thing of allowing them to move independently, and it worked. It worked great. We had a good activity of second in command, and so I decided to reuse and expand it in this game. Um, the system has some advantages and some disadvantages. The advantages are that second in commands are usually more active because they have something to do, but it also has the disadvantages of, on the one hand, requiring some more umpire workload, although it is not as significant as it would be if uh, if I introduce another full player. Um, And on the other hand, it's the problem that if a second in command went inactive, the player would have a worse experience. Um, he wouldn't receive all the information he should, and well, it made some players had a worse experience that they could have otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's valid. All right. So why don't you tell us what happened in the game? At a high level in 5 or 10 minutes, what describe the whole game. What occurred? What were the main events and the outcome?
Of course. Well, um, this that I have here is the positions at the beginning of the game. We had here a big concentration of French forces coming from France. Those are the veterans of the wars in Central Europe that are coming to Spain. But the French had also four corps already in the peninsula or in the surrounding areas. We had three corps here in this area and another corps here in Catalonia. Meanwhile, the Spanish troops were quite split, as you can see. We had troops in all this area, all of them south of the River Ebro, with the exception of the garrison of Rosas and the besiegers of Barcelona, which was a city controlled by the French but under siege since the beginning of the game. We had also some Spanish troops farther away from the front. We had the Army of Granada and the Army of Reserva, which were quite away from there and would take some time to arrive. And we also had the British here in northern Portugal, ready to move towards the area of Castile to meet the Spanish troops. Another British force bringing reinforcements was in the sea and would arrive uh, to a port in the next few days. They were given the choice to go to La Coruña, which was the historical destination, or another port of various they were given. They ended deciding going to Avilés, which is here, this and disembarked there a few days later. So the French plan was for these corps that were already in Spain to advance to Valladolid and capture it. From there, they would advance towards Madrid, which was the main objective of the French, but not the only one. They also had to destroy the Spanish army as much as possible, if possible, also the British army, and to capture also other important cities, as could be Zaragoza, Gerona, or keep Barcelona. So they had many objectives. Meanwhile, the Spanish didn't have a commander-in-chief because they didn't have it historically. There were many conflicts among the different Spanish generals. All of them wanted to be the commander-in-chief, and they couldn't reach an agreement. So I represented it by not giving them a commander-in-chief, and to avoid them from just selecting one, I said, well, you can select one, but your personal objective, I gave them personal objectives, and their personal objectives were to defend certain places of Spain and to not allow somebody else to be elected commander-in-chief. So, how did the game advance? I will show you a more advanced um, um, table, but the at the beginning the French advanced without opposition. Um, they reached Burgos easily, and the Spanish troops in Burgos evacuated the city and fled towards Aranda de Duero, where they were concentrating three armies. Um, Meanwhile, in Catalonia, they also crossed the frontier and advanced towards Barcelona, which was the first objective of the French in the area, which was to free Barcelona from the Spanish siege. And the Spanish had also sent reinforcements to the siege, which was an objective for this commander, the General Vives of the Army of Catalonia. Meanwhile, other Spanish were either marching, like the Army of Granada, or were resting, recruiting troops like the army of Reserva in Madrid or the army of Centro in Zaragoza. This thing, and we had the first combat not long after. The first thing happened in Castile, a small skirmish between the French and the Spanish around here, halfway between Burgos and Aranda de Duero. But the first battle as such happened here in Catalonia. The French concentrated here north of Barcelona and advanced to free the city. Meanwhile, the Spanish informed of the French presence, but with some bad intelligence because they were informed that the French numbers were way lower than they were in fact because they weren't aware that the French had concentrated moved to meet them. We had that way two battles that lasted in total 4 days around here, from the 1st of November to the 4th of November. Those were the Battle of Sabadell, which lasted the first 2 days, and the Battle of San Cugat that happened the 2 next days. The French defeated the Spanish, who at each night retreated a bit towards Barcelona, but the 4th of November they were finally decisively defeated. The army of Vives was badly defeated. They fled to Granollers, but were soon on the run and had to move around the area, fleeing from the French and trying to deceive them to lose their pursuits, which they managed in the end, but after some days and having lost a good amount of men. Meanwhile, the French troops in Catalonia, led by Saint-Cyr, advanced to Barcelona, fled the city, and then pursued the Spanish, while the few troops that had remained besieging Barcelona retreated to the south of this river here, the river Llobregat, and remained there for a few days. Meanwhile, in Castile, things were continued without a major engagement. The French troops occupied Valencia and with a corps in their flank here in a small village in some kilometers to their east, and the Spanish and the British finally met in Valladolid. There they concentrated. They now had the British army, with the exception of the reinforcements that were still coming from the north, and three Spanish armies: the army of Castile, the army of the center of General Castaños, and the army of Extremadura. They had some small skirmishes in the area, mainly by troops doing scouting, but they were in a major engagement. El Empecinado, with his guerrillas, did some skirmishing here, harassing French supplies, but other than that, not much happened. Meanwhile, the army of the left of General Blake had occupied Bilbao, and when Napoleon was finally informed of it, and after seeing that the information was correct, decided to split his troops in three groups. He had 6 corps here, so he sent 2 corps to Bilbao through the more direct route, through Durango and this area here, more or less this route. Another 2 more corps that he accompanied to Vitoria, and from there to the north to Bilbao, in order to pincer the Spanish troops in Bilbao and not let them flee, and two more corps to reinforce the troops that were here around Palencia, as it was the French didn't know exactly where were the main Spanish troops, but I think they did believe that they were here in this area. So, and meanwhile in Catalonia, Saint-Cyr pursued Vives, but made a bad mistake that was leaving Barcelona almost garrisoned, um, when there were still Spanish troops here. Not that many, but still a few thousands that were able to retake Barcelona a few days later, defeating its small garrison. Um, so we go some days further, and we will see that the French attack Bilbao. So what happens in Bilbao? Well, in Bilbao, there is first a battle in which the Spanish managed to ambush the French and cause them important casualties, including the capture of 4 batteries, which increased the already big number of guns that the Spanish here had. The French reorganized and waited for the arrival of Napoleon with the other group. This led to a battle in Bilbao around the 10th and 11th of November. In this battle, we had on the one hand a Spanish army of around 20 to 30,000 men against three French corps plus the Imperial Guard. The Spanish had the advantage of a very difficult terrain with a lot of hills, but on the other hand, the French had the numerical advantage and managed to surround the Spanish positions. In the end, Marshal Lefebvre managed to cross the river in Bilbao, to the north of Bilbao, taking by surprise the Spanish rear and managed to capture a lot of Spanish troops, while others managed to flee to the countryside and would flee in the following days towards Santander and further. Meanwhile, here in Castile, we had the first engagement that had a bigger number of troops involved, although it was still a small skirmish in near Palencia, around Dueñas, which is here. And the French troops withdrew to a position north of Palencia. They left the city and intended to be between Burgos and Palencia, or even if the situation required it, to Burgos. They also sent a message to Besiers, who was the corps that was to the east, to return to Lerma and, if necessary, to Burgos. And here in Castile, there would be two battles that would, in the end, decide the campaign, the main battles of the campaign. So the first of these battles happened when the British troops and the Spanish troops led an attack against the French around the city, around the village of Villodrigo, and managed to cause a bad defeat to the French. This was in 2 consecutive battles. The first, this is more or less the situation. It was difficult to show it in the operational map. We had also tactical maps in which it was shown better. But basically, the French were surrounded by 3 sides, only having this in the route to Burgos available. So after a night attack against a bridge by the British, which was successful, the French fought a battle here and fearing to be cut off from Burgos, they didn't commit many troops, and those troops that were committed were defeated. Meanwhile, the rest of their army was evacuating. They had a very big, very long supply train, which delayed them. So the next day, they fought another battle a bit to the north. And this battle was an absolute disaster for the French because they lost around 10,000 men that were taken prisoners by the British after being surrounded by British and Spanish troops. Ironically, after that action, the British and Spanish cohesion was lost somewhat. There were some conflicts among the commanders as the Spanish were not happy that the French had surrendered to the British, as the bulk of the troops were Spanish, and also the British had allowed the French to carry their supplies with them, to supply them in their march to a port in order to be then driven to Britain. And since the Spanish supply situation here was starting to be a bit concerning, they were quite low on supplies. They wanted to have those supplies, but the British didn't allow them. So they had that way the first conflicts among them, although they had some before, but those were the first main conflicts. After this small disaster for the French, there were some days of inactivity in Castile, as both armies spent their days in more or less the same places. On the one hand, the British and the Spanish remain a bit dispersed in the area around Palencia and Burgos, in the middle of those cities. In order to resupply, they were bringing supplies from Palencia and from Valladolid. And meanwhile, the French reorganized in Burgos and awaited the arrival of the reinforcements that had been sent by Napoleon and by Napoleon himself, who, after receiving news that things weren't going well in Castile, decided to go there after having taken Bilbao, as we saw before. So the final battle happened near Burgos, and so two big armies. I don't remember right now the exact amount of troops, but I can tell you in a second. We had um, we had 66,000 men for the French and 65,000 men for the Spanish and British. So a big battle, way bigger than any that happened historically in this campaign. And it was the decisive battle that decided the campaign. It saw the French moving south of Burgos. There is a river that goes south of Burgos and that moved in this direction. So the French moved with some of their troops in this side of the river to the south to cut the Spanish troops and rear. The British and the Spanish were not concentrated, as we have seen, and that allowed the French to cut the Allied force in two. So we had French troops in a village called Estepar, and with Spanish and British troops to the north and to the south, and also some to the west that kept the Spanish and British troops in contact with the other. The battle was a hard one for both sides. It was it could have been won by anyone. I think Napoleon thought at some times that he would lose the battle, but in the end, a grand charge led by Viziers broke the British troops in the south, and then turned around, causing chaos in the in the Spanish army. The troops that were to the north, the Spanish troops that were to the north, were also surprised by the arrival of more French in their rear. They had kept some troops here to uh, watch that no French came from there, but the French managed um, to cross the bridge and capture some Spanish there. And in the end, the Spanish and British troops fled. Many were captured. I think we calculated the prisoners in around 10,000 men, and the British troops and some of the Spanish would retreat to the south towards Valladolid. There, I decided to call the game because I thought that it was pretty decided. The French had won a major battle, a decisive battle, and while there were still Spanish troops in different places, and while the Spanish and British had some reinforcements here, in the end, I didn't think that they could do anything to avoid Madrid falling, and uh, and the campaign was decided, in my opinion. So I was also now a bit tired, as James has said. It was a long game. It had already been 7 months since it started, so I wanted to move on also to other projects, and with it decided I thought it was the time to call it.
Yeah. Can you show a TTS save state of the battle itself, the final battle, with all the little pieces,
Yes.
just for people watching to get a feel for what it looked like?
Well, the final battle was quite chaotic because we had lots of pieces and many of them were wagons, which caused more confusion, but it was. So I had to use maps of a big area because I wasn't sure how much it would occupy. It was also in the middle of the three seats of the map, and the main battle happened here in this village here, Stepar. The French had crossed it here through this bridge and had made more bridges here to aid in the crossing because they had many troops to cross. And meanwhile, the Spanish and British troops were here.
Mm-hmm.
There were also Spanish troops here covering this crossing here, and some French troops were here and ended forcing the crossing and cutting the Spanish rear here. The grand charge that decided the battle was done towards this direction with the many cavalry that the French have, and then those cavalry moved around the battlefield, causing much chaos. We had and the French had, I don't remember exactly, but I think that uh, maybe up to 20,000 cavalrymen, which is a lot. So
Were there any? So now that it's all done and you've had some time away from it, what learnings did you have as an umpire that you will, apply in other games or that you'd like to share with others?
well, one thing that I learned is that if you ever mention one aspect, you should develop it a lot because for the Siege of Roses, it's something that I haven't mentioned, but we had a game log. It lasted all game siege in the border fortress of Roses, which is in Catalonia. I mentioned the British Navy, which historically helped a bit in the siege, resupplying the Spanish troops that were defending the fortress. So it turned out we had a player that is very interested in naval warfare. Is probably one of the people in the IKS that knows more about that. And well, he decided to use the British Navy to his advantage. He conducted various operations with it, and I hadn't developed it when I was developing the game, so I had to improvise a lot. And while I think at the end it worked well, it would have been better if I had already had a system for all the naval aspects of the game. Also, another thing that I have learned, I think this game has told me I, that well, before this game, I always try to give the new reports in the same day of the deadline, so I would sometimes be a bit stressed about it. In this game, I also tried it, and I will also keep trying it. But I realized that well, if you can't in one day, 2 days is also fine, and even three if it is necessary. So
Yep, that's good to it's good learning. Don't kill yourself as an umpire. Let's see. I'm looking at comments. For those listening, feel free to write in comments or raise your hand if you want to talk. So Sean Mack wrote, "It was all going well, so well until the Spanish screwed it up." I think he must have been on the British team. Um,
yeah, he was.
yep. So yeah, for me as a player, it's a very fun game. I know I'm appreciative, and everyone else who plays appreciative for the time that you put into it to make it happen. It's always interesting to play these historical scenarios and get a feel for it, and you gain such a better understanding of the history of it by playing in it. So I appreciate you hosting that for everyone. Um, I guess, are there any final thoughts or comments that you want to give that I didn't ask about, or any highlights of the game that we missed?
Well, more or less the things that happened
I
were
can't help you,
there.
Adrian. Hold on.
There were many small I always try to make my reports more immersive for the people that is playing. So I would, for example, introduce many small events, and there were a lot of those. For example, I remember. Uh, to add things for the British that were still marching to the front. And I gave them a report once in which I said, when you were in a village here, one of your men killed a peasant. He claims that he did so in self-defense, but the peasants say that it wasn't in self-defense, that he killed the victim in I don't remember exactly the cause, but well, so the British received some men from the local council asking them to hand the murderer to be hanged, and the British had to decide what to do, if they wanted to risk a diplomatic incident, or if they wanted to risk morale dropping because the soldiers would see that one of their comrades was given to the Spanish, knowing that the British and the Spanish were allies, but their relationships were tense. So I gave many of those kind of anecdotes and events for people to stay engaged. So especially when they were far away from action, so that they didn't lose interest.
Yeah, that's good. Those are hallmarks of a good umpire. All right. Well, I really appreciate your time. We spent almost an hour, and I know there's a lot more we could dig into it, but I don't want to make this too long. So, thank you, Marcos, for hosting the game, for taking the time to speak and share it with us in this podcast, and looking forward to all your other games. Each of them is always top notch.
Thank you, James. Thank you for having me, and I hope that I haven't bored much with my talking.
No, not at all. Thanks to anyone who endured to the end listening to the podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye. Stop.